Thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Eugene Minconi.
And I'm Stacy Spector.
We're attorneys at Kirschenbaum and Kirschenbaum, and our topic today is Commercial Buildouts 101. Whether you're looking for a medical, dental use, restaurant, retail, or high-end, mid-range, or basic office, location is not the only thing that a tenant needs to consider when choosing a space for your business. As part of a new commercial real estate lease, tenants often want to construct a space to meet their needs. Stacy, can you explain what we are talking about when we use the word build out?
Happy to. A build out involves the process of customizing a space to meet a specific tenant's needs and preferences. This can include anything from installing walls and customizing electrical and plumbing systems. It's very common and in some circumstances necessary for a commercial tenant to customize the space to meet their needs. The idea is to create a space that meets the functional requirements of a tenant's particular business and reflects that tenant's brand and aesthetic.
Thank you. Types of build-outs often include a shell build-out, which includes basic structural elements like an HVAC system, electrical, plumbing, lighting, flooring, and walls. This space is typically delivered in a blank state condition. Then there's also a tenant improvement build-out. This involves customizing the space to fit the tenant's needs, including partition walls, specialized flooring, fixtures, custom lighting, and branding elements. When substantial alterations are necessary, who does the work and who will pay can be negotiated between the landlord and the tenant. Both landlord and tenant want the work done as quickly as possible. The tenant wants to operate in the space. The landlord wants the tenant to begin paying rent. So usually the tenant does not have a rent, because usually the tenant doesn't have a rent obligation until the work is complete and can operate their business. Who is responsible for the build out? The landlord offers sometimes a tenant improvement allowance where they contribute funds to the build out. There's a tenant funded build out where the tenant covers all customization costs, often in exchange for lower rent. And then there's another kind where they share the build out costs. The landlord and the tenant negotiate cost sharing arrangements. Stacy, in what situations would a tenant want to perform the build out?
So a tenant may prefer to perform their own build out to confirm that the build out meets their needs and is sufficient for their intended use. More established tenants may have a team and existing relationships with contractors and architects, and that way they can retain control of the process. They may have, if you're opening a medical office, for example, they may have architects and contractors that have experience in particular with building out medical space. A tenant may also require materials that are above asking standards and would exceed the cost of a building standard. And then the tenant is likely responsible to be paying for the difference in that cost if the landlord was covering all the other costs of the build out.
And why would a landlord want to perform the build out?
In some circumstances, the landlord would prefer to perform the build out. A landlord may be interested in retaining control of the quality, the materials used, and the timing of the build out. Generally, landlords do have long-standing relationships with contractors and subcontractors and architects, and are open to providing a build out for particular tenants, assuming that the tenant signs a lease term for at least 5 years. However, the cost of the landlord building out the space may pass down to a tenant in some other way, shape, or form. In other words, they may charge additional rent or extra charges for the landlord performing this build out and building out tenant space.
Okay, so common solutions. There are typically two common solutions are if the landlord makes the alterations, the tenant pays part of all the expenses. And if the tenant makes the alteration, the landlord may provide a tenant improvement allowance or a credit to cover some or all of the costs. The landlords also sometimes charge review fees, constructions to get the plans reviewed and for their approval. And often tenants can negotiate this fee and the review time period. All right, let's talk about work letters. A work letter is a document that outlines the specific build out and construction for a space. It can either be drafted into the commercial lease and attached as an exhibit, or separate, or it could be a separate document. Most work letters include a budget for the build out, and this is very important because the typical costs can range anywhere from a basic office of $100 to $100 per square foot to a medical, where it could be anywhere from $200 to $400 a square foot. So it's very important that the budget is put into the workout letter. And this often does not include what the potential contingency costs may be, which is usually 10 to 20% for unexpected expenses. Also included in the workout letter is a timeline for the work to be done, and then maybe the specific parties that will be working on the build out. What are some workout considerations?
So some work letter considerations that tenants want to be sure to include in their lease agreement is the responsibilities of both parties. One important one is who's obtaining the permits and the plans. So there's an expense and time involved in these two things. So it's important to decide early on in lease negotiations who's going to be involved in controlling this process. If the landlord performs the build out, typically the landlord would be the party required to obtain permits, and same goes if the tenant is the one performing the build out. So parties often want to know, what does the approval process look like? Typically, you're required to obtain approval from the applicable governing authority. That's usually the building department where the property is located. And oftentimes parties incur delays based upon seeking those approvals. So that's something to be aware of when you're trying to plan and budget for your build out. Typically, the lease will have provisions to allow for certain delays, like force majeure and things of that nature. And it's important for a tenant to include provisions to protect the tenant if there are delays outside of the tenant's control, like rent abatements or potential termination options. And that's why the timeline for the build out is very important. So often, if the landlord is the one performing the build out, there will be lease provisions requiring the landlord to complete the build out within a certain period of time. That way the tenant is ready to open up the space and begin operating its business as timely as possible. It's important also to note who's going to be supervising the work. If the landlord's performing the build out, the landlord of course is going to be supervising everything, but the tenant also is going to want to be involved and inspect the space and make sure that the space and the build out is meeting tenants' needs. And vice versa, if the tenant is overseeing the build out, the landlord is still going to want to be involved and inspect the entire process and be sure that the tenant is performing the build out in accordance with the plans approved by the landlord and in accordance with permits and all governmental approvals that are required. Another thing to note is that it's important to have a construction plan in place before signing the lease. It's important for tenants to know what they're going to be getting into so there's no surprises. It allows the tenant and the tenant's design team, inclusive of architects, engineers, and contractors, to review the layout of the space and to determine how to comply with all the permits and approvals and all rules and regulations of the building department. Architects and engineers are likely to be aware of necessary considerations for a space, such as compliance with the Americans with Disability Act, any parking and delivery requirements, and mechanical system updates. That's why it's important to hire architects and contractors who are experienced in these types of build outs for the space that the tenant intends to use it for. Having a construction plan before signing the lease will allow the team to identify any potential problems early on and resolve them as quickly as possible, which will lead to less delays, errors, and any unforeseen substantial costs.
And the cost and budget considerations can be substantial. The cost of build out can range anywhere from $50 to $250 per square foot, depending on the complexity. Hidden costs may include permit fees, utility upgrades, or unexpected structural issues. And there's usually common challenges, which are like delays due to the permits, material shortages, or even labor issues, budget overruns from unexpected costs or design changes, and compliance with local zoning and building codes are all things that can be a challenge when you're having your consideration. Permits. All right, we spoke a little about permits. Before beginning the build out, it's necessary to obtain permits and approvals from the government agencies. A hired professional can ensure that the necessary permits are applied for, and a landlord will likely require obtaining the permits within a specific amount of time after the execution of the lease. So it's good to have everything in place as you are signing. All right, know your needs. Every business is different. And if you are a financial company, an insurance company, a real estate, or maybe a law firm, you have different needs than a technology company or an advertising company, a media company. And so, for example, a law firm may need a space for confidential communications between a lawyer and a client. An accounting firm might need 8 offices at a conference room, whereas a tech startup company likely would prefer an open floor plan to enhance a collaborative work environment. So it's good to know what your needs are as before you're really going into the lease negotiation. Stacy, what are some of the pros and cons of hiring architects and engineers?
So an architect can help determine the space for your business needs. They can help you plan a layout for the space and ensure that your space complies with all building codes, all regulations, and all rules of the building department. Further, the architect can also supervise the construction and be sure to oversee that all the work is being done in accordance with the architect's drawings and plans. Another pro is if you hire an experienced architect, they have the background education, training, and the experience to guide you through the process. The architect can play a key role in finalizing the budget and consider designs to optimize performance and choose durable materials for a customized and unique layout. The cons for hiring an architect are, of course, the higher upfront costs, longer project timeline for the design process, and potentially there could be creative differences and communications between the tenant and its hired architect. There are also pros and cons of hiring engineers. An engineer will assist in deciding whether the space has the technical requirements to suit the needs of the business. This is important as some businesses have different mechanical needs than others. Examples are sometimes you require additional HVAC systems or electrical wiring depending on what type of business will be operating in the space. A pro of hiring an engineer is that the engineer can help choose the quality, corrosion, weather resistant materials, and the engineer would have knowledge to enhance the structural safety of the space. A con would be additional cost to your budget and potential disagreements with other parties like other hired professionals.
Okay, so there's also pros and cons of hiring contractors. The contractor constructs the space according to the building plans. The pro about the contractor that they provide additional insight into the development of the build out and can perform cosmetic alterations such as installing flooring, painting, and repairing electric and plumbing issues. Obviously, a con is additional cost to your budget and subcontractor liability. Landlords often going to require a licensed contractor to make alterations to especially electrical, gas, and plumbing systems. And it's imperative that your contractor be licensed and obtain the approval of the landlord. So once everything has been negotiated, the lease can be signed and your build out can commence. Just to go through the steps of the commercial build out again, lease negotiation defines who pays for the build out and what's included in the lease agreement. The planning and design you work with architects, contractors, designers to draft blueprints and select materials. Permit and approvals. You secure the necessary permits that ensure compliance with local building codes. Construction and build out execution. Contractors execute the design plan, making necessary modifications. And then finally, you do inspection and completion. You're going to do your final walkthrough, inspections and approvals before occupancy. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to us speak on Commercial Buildouts 101. If we can be of service or answer any questions, please contact us. We're to help evaluate your opportunities. Make sure to protect yourself before entering into any agreement. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today.